Okay, so good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Anyone who wants to turn on their cameras is welcome, and hopefully more people will join us in the next few minutes. So thanks for all those who have come out of the woodwork. We haven't seen each other in a while. And I'm glad to welcome our guest lecturer this afternoon, Aשיש Avikuntak, who is a filmmaker and a cultural anthropologist, currently based at the University of Rhode Island in the US. But as you can guess, he comes from another place, from India, Kolkata. Is that correct?
Yes.
And Ašiš is going to talk to us about, not about his films, but about his cultural anthropology project, one which he carried out in the first part of the millennium. And it's basically about the subject in his book, which was published a couple of years ago, Bureaucratic Archaeology, State, Science, and Past in Postcolonial India. And this was the subject of your PhD at Stanford, correct?
Yes.
So Ašiš has a dual personality, one as a filmmaker and artist, and another as an anthropologist and part of the crowd that we know at Stanford around Ian Hodder and Michael Shanks and their students. There are some very interesting parallels between Israeli and Indian archaeology in the sense that both have a strong British substratum. So we'll hear more about that in this talk. Ašiš will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So thanks, Ašiš, and you can get started.
Thank you, Rafi, for inviting me. Thanks, everybody, for joining this talk. I understand things in your university is fictitious, if that would be the right way of putting it. So thank you, everybody who has made time to come. What I'm going to do, I'm not going to do a typical academic presentation, read a paper or show PowerPoint. I'm going to do a more informal talk about the book and about the state of archaeology in general, and specifically what the trajectory it has taken in India over the last century, about a century and a half. So before I begin, a little bit, I'm going to start with a little bit of biography. Before I got into archaeology, I worked as a political activist in India. My early years as a student, I was basically working as an activist for an ecological and environmental activist. There was a large dam being built in central India, which would displace close to about 250,000 people. It would be one of the largest dams in the world. So I was very closely involved with that political. I was organizing there, working there. I have actually an undergraduate degree in social work while I was doing that. It was the short story of the whole movement is that it collapsed. We failed. The large dam was built. It's now the second largest dam in the world. In central India, and it displaced close to about approximately about 300,000 people, more than 250,000 people, and so that was that. While I was working with this political work as an ecological activist, something dramatic started transforming in India, which was the rise of Hindu fundamentalism. Now we know that if we know history of South Asia, that in 1947 South Asia was partitioned into what is called India and Pakistan, and one of the reasons of partition was on the basis of religious differences. So Pakistan becomes an Islamic country, and India continued to be a secular country. But by the late 80s, within the secular constitutional fabric of India, there was a strong threat of the rise of Hindu fundamentalism, which over the last 30 years has reached almost a logical conclusion with the present Prime Minister of India, Mr. Narendra Modi, who has been the Prime Minister for the last 9 years, is a strong Hindu fundamentalist, comes from a very strong Hindu fundamentalist political group. So the reason I'm giving you this context, because this is something very important to understand the nature of archaeology in India. Archaeology is not merely an academic work in India. It is, which is something that you would, it has, like in other parts of the world, especially in Europe, it has a strong political context. But in India, archaeology almost becomes an arsenal for political battles. And at the forefront has been, in the last 30, 35 years, Hindu fundamentalists who have been using Indian archaeological heritage, Indian archaeological materiality, Indian archaeological architecture as a very, very powerful tool to transform India into a strong Hindu state. And the process is already on the way. We are, as I said, the present Prime Minister is from that particular strong Hindu fundamentalist group. And so, as I said, when I was doing my political work in 1992, in December of 1992, there was a mosque in central India, a mosque called Babri Mosque, which was built by the first Mughal emperor in India around the 16th century. And this was considered to be a disputed site because the Hindu fundamentalists believed that the mosque was built over Hindu temple. The argument, the narrative was that the mosque was built by Babur, the first Mughal emperor, by destroying an earlier Hindu temple. And so in the late 80s, there was a very strong political movement spearheaded by the party that Prime Minister Narendra Modi belongs to destroy this mosque, this medieval mosque. In a sense, this was, to put it very blatantly, or to put it very almost obscenely, it was some kind of a revenge destruction, that we have to destroy this medieval mosque because it was built on an earlier Hindu temple. Now, the evidence, the archaeological evidence of a Hindu temple under this medieval mosque was very slim. But, and this is where archaeology comes into the picture, and this is where I personally get into this world, is that in 1992, the mosque was demolished by a group of mob. In matters of hours, a large medieval mosque was demolished by Hindu fundamentalist mob. It was, and I was at that time, as I said, I was working as a political activist, so this really affected me, and then began a journey which eventually gives birth to this book that I think Rafi has circulated the introduction in the first few pages, about 60 pages, for you to have to go through it. So I, at that time, was a teenager. I got very, very affected by this destruction, because what happened is that, like what usually happens or has been happening in India, in South Asia for more than a century, is that whenever such political events occur, there is communal riots. I was then in the city of Bombay. This is December of 1992. For nearly a month and a half, this large cosmopolitan city, one of the largest cities in the world, saw a series of horrific riots, and I was part of the rioting city for nearly those 1.5 months. So I saw what, and that's where the connection for me emerges, that how archaeological evidence is made as political arsenal, which eventually leads to a destruction of a mosque, which causes large-scale communal riots all across India. Approximately in the 1992 communal riots, the numbers are very weird in India because there's a huge discrepancy between the official numbers, that is the numbers that the state puts up, and the numbers on the ground. But approximately between 5,000 to 10,000 people were killed over the course of nearly about 2 to 3 weeks of rioting. And Bombay was the center of such riots where nearly 2,000 people were killed. And I was very closely involved in the relief work in aftermath of the riots. So this had a very powerful impact on my imagination. I was at that time a 20-year-old young man, and as I said, I was working as an environmental activist. So this became part of my life. Then in 1994, I joined almost accidentally the Department of Archaeology. It's a college called Deccan College. It's a 50-year-old archaeological university in India. It's one of the most let's say at that time, it was one of the most creditable archaeological departments in the country. So I studied there for 2 years. And what I found was something that really almost, again, was a shocker, is that I found a lot of my professors and the larger Indian archaeological community being very, let's say, unarchaeological, if I can use that word. Basically, what it meant is that these archaeologists, both some of them were universities, a lot of them were part of the state archaeological body that is called, it's an organization called the Archaeological Survey of India. The Archaeological Survey of India is the earliest statist archaeological body in the world. It was established in the 1850s, and this is here the British connection becomes very. That's the birth of. This is how the British connection becomes very important, because it is a British. Basically, they were British surveyors who were part of the colonial army, who were responsible in starting the Archaeological Survey of India. So I'll just go back. I'll go back to the story of Archaeological Survey of India a little later, but I just want to give you a larger lay of the land of what was archaeology in the 90s and continues to be. So the story hasn't changed in the last 30 years. So if you read my book, although the core of the archaeological ethnography was done between 2003 and 2005, but things have not changed in any way in the last 30 years, right? So what you see, the ethnographic work that I do is a snapshot of a moment in the history of Archaeological Survey of India, but one can easily say that this is how archaeology was done in the 1960s and 70s and 80s and continues to be done by the state in India. So one can, you have to think in that sense, although I have a very specific moment where I'm working. And that's a very important political moment also. I'll explain you why. So as I said, when I was studying, I realized that the larger Indian archaeological community, that is the larger community of Indian archaeologists, some in the universities, a majority, I would say, in the Archaeological Survey of India, along with archaeologists in various states. So we have about 30 odd states in India, and almost each state would have its own Department of Archaeology. Now, just to give you a context of the nature of archaeological materiality in India, it is humongous. The nature of archaeological materiality is just astonishing, in the sense that we are talking about starting. I'm not going to take into account the Paleolithic and the Neolithic cultures, but if we start from the Indus civilization, which is around 2,500, 300, 3,000 BCE, starting around that time till about the British archaeological remains, we're talking about nearly 4,000 to 5,000 years of continuous human settlement in many parts of India. So especially when we are excavating sites in North India and in the northern Gangetic Plain in North India, we are digging or excavating what we call multicultural sites, where we have continuous human habitation for nearly 4,000 years, continue to the present time. So this is a very complicated archaeological universe, because it is just not merely a couple of cultures or a dozen cultures. We talk about hundreds of cultures in certain cases, of fair amount of sophistication, which we don't have much clue. Although a lot of these archaeological cultural world, for instance, if we talk about medieval India, we have analogous written records, but often the literary records and the archaeological records do not match. And so therefore what happens, there's a huge amount of interpretative mismatch that often happens, which becomes politically, which is used politically, which is the case with the mosque that I spoke about. So what happened, what I realized, that a lot of archaeologists in India were basically not, what's the right word, evidential in the kind of work they were doing. Let's say the evidence was such that the interpretative possibilities were immense, so that you have a group of archaeologists in the Archaeological Survey of India excavating sites like the Babri Masjid, which is where the mosque was demolished, and using very, very slim data to state with a fair amount of scientific credibility, because they were statist archaeologists, to suggest that there was a temple under the mosque. So, what I'm just trying to say is that it's a minefield in India. Archaeology generally is a minefield in many parts of the world, as we all know. But in India, it is a very, what should I say, the fuse is more closer to the bomb than other parts of the world, if I can use that analogy. And archaeology is constantly used. It's being used even today. And so my experience of working as a student archaeologist in the mid-90s made me dismay. I got really frustrated with the nature of archaeology, because on one hand, we would be reading people like Binford and processual archaeology. Ian Hodder's work was still considered too avant-garde, and it was not really used by our professors, but some of us who were really interested would look for the post-processual work, but it was still considered to be too, what should I say, too sophisticated for the Indian archaeologist. What I realized during those years, that Wheeler, Sir Mortimer Wheeler, that some of you would be familiar with, was a defining figure in Indian archaeology. But I finished my master's degree in 1996. Then I went back to doing political work in Bombay. I basically worked in a slum in Bombay for about 3 years, from 96 to 99. Then in early 2000, I ended up at Stanford to do my PhD. And I started working with Ian Hodder and Michael Shanks. Stanford also had a couple of South Asian anthropologists, so I started working with them. And with them, I started to look more closely at the state of Indian archaeology. So I was actually my initial idea was to write a history of Indian archaeology, but primarily because of Shanks, because of Michael, he said that, this is a good project, but I think it might be fruitful to do something more ethnographic. And this is also the time in the early 2000s that scholars like Latu was just emerging in the field of social sciences. Science technology studies was also emerging. So I basically, as a student, got very, very fascinated by STS, by Latour and his work among scientists. And what I did is that I used a Latourian toolbox, and I went back to India and between 2003 and 2005. Now, the year 2003 is something very, very important in the history of Indian archaeology. Now, if you remember, I told you about the mosque that was demolished, right, in 1992. From 1992 to 2003, the discourse over the destruction of the mosque and the fact that there was or there could have been a temple under the destroyed mosque took a juridical turn, and court cases were being filed. Eventually, a high court, a state high court. So we have Supreme Court, and then below it is the High Court. So the state high court in North India decided, and this is quite a radical gesture on the part of judicial probe in India, that for the first time, the court in India decides that archaeologists would be involved to excavate the site under the destroyed mosque to find out if there was a temple or not. Now, that process starts around 1992 with the destruction of the mosque. And in 2003, Archaeological Survey of India decides, gets the juridical nod to excavate under the mosque that was destroyed. Now, this is quite a significant moment in the history of Indian archaeology, because in nearly about 150 years, never was archaeology in any sense summoned to the court to provide evidence. And this is quite a radical moment. And I ended up reaching India after doing my coursework at Stanford to do ethnography. Now, I actually wanted to work at the site of Ayodhya where they were excavating, but I was not given permission because I did not have what the lawyers suggested. I did not have any, I don't know the legal language, but I was an outsider. So I didn't know, I would not be allowed in this space, which was considered a location of evidence, juridical evidence. So because I was an outsider. And so what I did is that the archaeological excavation at Ayodhya, so the location is the Ayodhya Babri Masjid compound where the excavation was being held. A couple of months later, so I started doing ethnography of archaeologists at a Harappan site. Now, this is another, so I'm sorry, this world is getting complicated, but if you hold on, I think there'll be a little bit of clarity. So you have Ayodhya, Babri Masjid, which is a medieval mosque, destroyed in 1992, excavated in 2003. So hold on to that story for a minute. The other big story in India has been the Indus civilization. So the Indus civilization was officially discovered in 1924 by Sir John Marshall and his deputies in the Archaeological Survey of India. And Indus Valley from 1924 onwards have become one of the symbolic identity of South Asia, and especially for Indians. So whenever you hear of this, that we are a 5,000-year-old civilization, basically we realize only in 1924 that we were a 5,000-year-old civilization, right? So and so the Harappan civilization or the Indus civilization is a very, very powerful archaeological landscape, which has close to about 5 to 6 monumental metropolis like Mohenjo-daro, like Harappa, like Dholavira, and nearly about 1,500 sites, village or small settlement sites. So it's a monumental landscape, archaeological landscape, put together. For instance, archaeologists have told us that if you take the Egyptian civilization, the Chinese civilization, and the Mesopotamian civilization, if you put all their square kilometer together, then the Indus civilization is actually larger than 3 put together. So it's quite a mind-boggling space. And also because here you have a civilization that is spread all the way from Western Pakistan to Central India. And it has been a very prestigious archaeological. So when I mean very prestigious, that if you are a senior archaeologist in India, if you're a prestigious archaeologist, you would excavate in a Harappan site. So the Harappan sites is considered to be the most prestigious archaeological sites to excavate in India. Now, please keep in mind, we have the Buddhist archaeological sites, we have the Hindu archaeological sites, we have the Islamic archaeological sites, we have the British archaeological sites, we have the Paleolithic sites, the Neolithic sites. So it's in this whole minefield of sites and sites, archaeological sites, the Harappan sites are considered to be the ultimate, basically because it is so close to the identity of what it means to be Indian, what it means to be an Indian civilization. So and my training in Deccan College from 94 to 96 was mostly as a Harappan archaeologist. The early works that I did as a student field worker was to excavate in late Harappan archaeological sites, which was being excavated by Deccan College, where I was studying then. What happens is that since I could not get permission to do ethnography in the 2003 Ayodhya excavations, I then decided to do the second best thing that I could, was to excavate, to do ethnography of the Harappan sites that the Archaeological Survey of India was excavating. Now, if you think the landscape is not too complicated, I will make it more complicated here. Because the Harappan, the Indus civilization, and the Harappan civilization is also a very strong world for Hindu right-wing political arsenal building. And so the second chapter of my book deals with that, if you want to go in details. But to put it very, very simply, the Hindu right-wing argue for that the birth of Indo-European language, or what is called the Indo-European language, happened in the form of early Sanskrit in Harappa. Right? Now, this is complete, pardon my French, bullshit. But this is how over the last 30, 40 years, there is a huge pseudo-Hindu right-wing archaeological narrative being constructed about this. Evidence after evidence, starting from archaeological evidence to linguistic evidence to other forms of evidence, there's a huge evidence to suggest that nothing like that had happened. And now in the last 5 years, we have ancient DNA evidence, genetic evidence, which has almost nailed the coffin on this theory. But even then, the Hindu right-wing ecosphere is pushing for this narrative. So, this is almost, when we talk about Hindu nationalism and fundamentalism, we are also talking about a very strong fascist political tendencies. And I mean, again, I'm very happy to speak about it if you want more details about what I mean. Fascist in all senses, but ideologically fascist, and pushing a very powerful falsehood on all accounts, including archaeology. And so the Harappan site becomes a very strong area of transformation of this political project. So again, 2003 is a very interesting moment, is that at that time, the Hindu right wing, the BJP party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, the acronym is BJP, they were in power then. At that time, Mr. Modi was not in power. Another elderly statesman was in power, a gentleman called Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And under his government, they decided that the government of India, under Archaeological Survey of India, will excavate about 20 Harappan sites to find out if the Indo-European what we call out of India theory, that the Indo-Europeans moved from out of India and went all over. So basically it's the opposite. It's basically the Aryan theory in the opposite. The argument is that Aryans were native to India, native to Harappans, and they went all across the world, which is, as I said, which is complete bullshit. So, but what happened is because the archaeological Hindu right wing was so powerful that they convinced the government of India, which was then also Hindu right wing, to start a multi-site excavation project called the Swarasati Heritage Project. Again, the word Swarasati is a complicated thing, but I'll speak about that a little later. I'm sorry, making the whole thing too complicated, but in order to understand what is happening, I have to create this web of complication. Only then, hopefully, we can make a certain sense. Anyway, so the state funded the Archaeological Survey of India to excavate these projects. In 2003, the same year Ayodhya was being excavated. So I ended up in the winter of 2003, spending nearly 2 years, from 2003 to 2005, working with the archaeologists who had also excavated in Ayodhya, which is a right-wing project, and excavating in Harappa, which is also a right-wing project. So basically what I did from 2003 to 2005 was basically spend 2 years working, talking, observing, listening to archaeologists of the Archaeological Survey of India who had strong right-wing tendencies.
Ashish,
Yes.
Did they profess these tendencies out loud, or was it?
No, so
their claim was that they are just pure scientists.
Okay, no. So thank you for the question, Rafi. So there were some senior archaeologists who profess themselves as what is called Hindutva archaeologists. The other more easy term is we call them saffron archaeologists. Saffron is a sacred color in Hinduism, which has been co-opted by Hindu fundamentalists. So we call them saffron archaeologists. So there were a bunch of senior archaeologists who would openly call themselves as saffron archaeologists, that they were very interested in excavating sites to find out the monumental Hindu heritage of India, right? The younger archaeologists were a little bit more, what is the right word? They were a little bit more cautious, but some of them would also openly align with the saffron archaeologists. This was in 2000 and 2003 and 2005. In 2004, there was an election in India, and the Hindu right-wing BJP party was defeated. And from 2004 to 2014, we had the Congress party, which is a more liberal centrist party. But in 2014, again, the right-wing party came in the form of Mr. Modi. So what you see is that in the last 20 years, what I have noticed that some of the younger archaeologists who were a little cautious of calling themselves saffron now openly, in the last 10 years, openly call for a saffronization of Indian archaeology, because that is what the Indian state wants, right? So in this context, now if this is the larger context which I've tried to explain you simplistically, in this larger context, I enter and I'm very interested, not so much in what saffron archaeologists do. I'm really interested in what archaeologists do in India. You know, I'm not interested in, you know, I know this is the larger cultural political zone in which I'm entering, which is the Ayodhya excavation, the Harappan excavations. But for me, the fundamental questions are more deeper. I'm interested in knowing, how do archaeologists in the trenches of South Asia produce knowledge? And that is when I started doing ethnography, I found a British gentleman hovering over the state of Indian archaeology like a dark hegemonic cloud. And that gentleman is Sir Mortimer Wheeler. Now, what you see in India is the archaeology that was being practiced, or that is still being practiced, is what in the history of archaeology, archaeological practice, we will call cultural history archaeology. There is very little of processual archaeology being practiced in India. There are very, very few people, archaeologists, who will claim themselves to be processualists. And there is almost none who would claim themselves to be post-processualist of any variety, right? We know post-processual archaeologies have different kinds of archaeologies being practiced. So in India, we do not have any kinds of post-processualists. India, even now, and so my book basically then is basically a very, very microscopic ethnography of cultural history practice that was that we know as the Wheelerian method, the Kingian Wheelerian method, being followed in India under the larger landscape of heavily politicized archaeological world. So once I start talking to people, what I see is that all kinds of archaeologists, not just the saffron archaeologists, even people who do not consider themselves saffron archaeologists. Now, the important thing is, keep in mind, is that my ethnographic work is only with the Archaeological Survey of India. I was not doing ethnography of archaeological excavation by university departments. There are about 15 to 20 university departments in India. They also excavate, but the only problem is that the license for excavation is given by Archaeological Survey of India. So you can't randomly decide to excavate. Now, in order to get license is not simply given on the basis of the archaeologist's academic credential. It is also given on the basis of the archaeologist's political connections. So you have to understand that if you are an archaeologist in India and you want to excavate, especially these politically potent sites, that is from the Harappan till the medieval sites, those licenses are not very easily got. Archaeologists who get these licenses university archaeologists who get this license have to be politically right. And so because there are a number of instances in India where university archaeologists have been excessively or even mildly critical of Archaeological Survey of India, their careers were destroyed because they were never given licenses to excavate. So Indian university archaeologists are basically very, very cautious and they toe a very careful political line, because only if they toe the right line that they will get the license to excavate, which is given by the Archaeological Survey of India. Also, if we look at although there are more university excavations that happen in India, but those university excavations are very, very small, which is exactly what archaeologists should practice, right? You excavate small sites and you maximize your data from as little excavation as you do, right? So these are very small sites, but the sites of Archaeological Survey of India are humongously huge. When I mean by humongously huge is that they would excavate in one season a site as large as about 10 to 20 to 30 acres. So you talk about again, that is the nature of Indian, especially the nature of Indian archaeological sites, especially the historic sites, that they're huge, right? You have, as I explained to you earlier, some of these sites even have contemporary settlements. So we talk about huge sites. So when Archaeological Survey of India is excavating, they also excavate in a very monumental fashion. So for instance, in one season, they will open, and you can see a couple of images in my book, although if you look at the records of the ASI, you will see much more explicit images about how they excavate. So they would excavate, they would open up a 10 by 10 meter excavation trench about 20 to 40 in one season. Each season is about 90 to 100 days. This is astonishingly huge work. And so so just hold on. So I'm just trying to say, what I'm trying to give you in comparison is that this is how Archaeological Survey India excavate, whereas the university excavation, because they have little funding, they would excavate 2 or maybe 5 trenches a season. So when I was because I was very interested in the political impetus of Indian archaeology, so I decided not to do ethnography of university excavation. I wanted to focus on to do an ethnography of the Archaeological Survey of India, which is the statist body, which is the largest excavation, and they would excavate these large sites. The other thing that you have to keep in mind is that the data, that is the reports that the Archaeological Survey of India produces, they are considered to be legal records of the state. The university excavation, even though they might publish in some of the most prestigious peer-reviewed journals, are not considered that prestigious or that important, because so basically if the ASI sites have a strong legal and a juridical valence in comparison to other excavators who might be probably far more brilliant archaeologists in the way they excavate, and they publish in places like Antiquity or in really top-notch journals, those reports are not considered that valuable. So here there is all that. Yeah, Rafi.
I just wanted to point out to the students that in Israel, we also receive our licenses from the Antiquities Authority. It is not currently politicized, but that is one of the directions in which the current government wants to take things, to politicize things like archaeological licenses and heritage. And the second thing is that also here, if you go to the High Court for any kind of dispute, the Antiquities Authority is considered correct until absolutely proven incorrect. So the baseline of, let's say, a High Court petition in Israel is that what the Antiquities Authority says is the legal truth. And unless you put enormous effort to overturn that, then that's accepted. So this is a shared shared situation that we have in common. Yeah.
Should I continue, Rafi?
Yeah. No, go ahead. Yes, that's all I wanted to point out.
So there's a difference. So as I said, my idea was to focus on just the ASI. So once I go to the ASI, and here I see that the excavation methods are colonial. The whole culture of archaeological excavation in India is very, very colonial. Because, for instance, not only it is what I found, it is not only epistemological colonial in the form of using the methods that Mortimer Wheeler introduces in India, but it's also ontologically colonial. The kind of hierarchy that exists between the senior archaeologists, the junior archaeologists, the non-officer archaeologists, the student archaeologists, and fundamentally the local laborers. Now you have to understand, when you're excavating a site, so my major work happens in 2003 and 2005 at a site called Dholavira. Now, Dholavira is the 5th largest metropolis of Harappan civilization, which is in Western India. So you have 5 big Harappan metropolis civilization. One is Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, both of them are in Pakistan. There is another site which have yet to be excavated called Ganeriwala, which is also in Pakistan. Now, when I'm talking about metropolis, we're talking about these sites are large cities, large ancient cities, some of them as large as, for example, if I might be wrong with the numbers, but about 100 to 200 acres. So they're huge sites. And then there are two such large sites in India. One is Rakhigarhi, which is in northern India, and the other one is Dholavira, which is in western India. So when I was there, I did an ethnography at Dholavira. They were excavating Dholavira for the last 12 years. So this was the last year before the excavation ended. Now, when I was excavating, and then I worked in other sites also, but most of these sites where I excavated, there would be a labor, as in the laboring workmen were local tribal or local what we call landless laborers. So in India, you have a huge population of landless laborers, that is people who are considered to be the poorest of the poor in India. They are way below poverty line because they do not have their own land, and they would work as daily wage laborers in agrarian societies, right? So whenever Indian archaeological excavation occurs, almost majority of workmen who would work in these sites would be agrarian landless laborers. Some of them also tribals. Now this, for example, just this idea of using landless laborers who are not trained archaeologists, they are not even trained in any sense. They are only there to dig and shovel. But what is very interesting, sometimes some workmen are trained by trained archaeologists to look for specific artifacts. For example, in Dholavira, I'll give an example. This is quite a stunning example. I speak about that in my work, that Dholavira did not have a paleoarchaeologist, a zooarchaeologist, somebody who would look at animal bones. Now, if you know any of these sites, they produce a monumental amount of animal bones. And in Dholavira, for instance, along with pottery, every 10 by 10 into 10 meter habitation settlement would produce few kgs of animal bones. But ASI did not have a zooarchaeologist in its role at Dholavira over the course of 12 years of excavation. What is very interesting, sometimes, if you know of this very important, well-known, I won't call it very important, well-known zooarchaeologist, Richard Meadows, who teaches at Harvard, he and one of his students would sometimes, they came to Dholavira over the course of 12 years, 2 or 3 times. And they taught one local workman how to identify animal bones. So here is the issue, is that over the course of 12 years, you don't have a zooarchaeologist, you have a local landless laborer, who's trained to be a zooarchaeologist. So what is very interesting is that you have people like that. You have some of the workmen who I met and I spoke to, they were extraordinary archaeologists. Because just imagine there's a person who is working at the same site years after years after years. His or her understanding of that site is sometimes far more sharper than archaeologists who sometimes are being transferred from site to site. Now, when you are Indian archaeological ASI excavates on these large sites, we are talking, especially as I explained to you earlier, they are excavating close to about 20 to 30 trenches or sometimes 40 trenches in a season. We are talking about at least 200 to 300 laborers. It's a huge workman. So you have 200 to 300 laborers with about 4 or 5 trained archaeologists. And they're excavating this lake. So what happens is, and this strategy or this style of excavation even predates Wheeler. So it basically starts with John Marshall in the early 20th century when he's excavating these large sites in northern India. When we talk about, he's basically excavating large Buddhist sites. And this is pre-Wheeler excavation, so they're basically glorified treasure hunters. And which is very similar to the kind of excavation you would see in late 19th and early 20th century Egypt and Mesopotamia. They're basically, frankly speaking, they're basically digging treasures that eventually reaches British Museum. right? That is what they are doing. And when they are doing these kind of excavation, they are using hundreds and few hundred, sometimes even 1,000 labor in these large sites. So when Wheeler comes in 1944, now, so Mortimer Wheeler is a very interesting character because he is, along being an archaeologist, he is also somebody who was in the army. He fought in World War I, and then he also fought in World War II. So he has a very strong military disciplinary training. So what he does when he comes to India in 1944 is that he basically disciplines this kind of an archaeological excavation. And Wheeler is also very, what's the right word, articulate and eloquent in his writings. So all his writings that you see about his intervention in Indian archaeology from 1944 to 1948 is also heavily documented by him in the forms of letters, in the forms of his books, in the forms of memos he is writing. So I use a lot of these in talking about the kind of work he's doing. Basically what he does is he is like a colonial military officer who is going to discipline the natives. It's a very simple project. What he does is that he not only disciplines the natives epistemologically, that is the disciplined way of producing knowledge, but he also disciplines them ontologically in creating hierarchies, which obviously existed before him, but he kind of streamlines it. So by the time I am doing ethnography in early 21st century, I must admit, with all my political and liberal thing, I'm aghast to see a archaeological practice which is nearly 70, 80 years old, has not changed at all. And what makes it more shocking for me is that you have archaeologists justifying that method to be the most efficient method and they would say that the Wheeler method, this method, they would always say, this Wheeler method is the most efficient for India. And because I was at that time a PhD student at Stanford, they would always say, you can go to America. In America, you can do this. But in India, this is the only method that will run, which I, frankly speaking, beg to differ because, and we can talk about that. But so what you see in my book is the first two chapters gives you the political nature of the archaeological world. My first chapter, the chapter that I've shared, gives you the theoretical framework where I'm trying to intervene. The nature of, archaeology, as we know, global archaeology, it's still kind of figuring out what it is. It has been having an identity crisis since Binford, I would say, and the crisis hasn't gone away, right? So in the introduction chapter, I talk about this crisis, and then I try to then explain that why I think looking at South Asia is a very good example to see where archaeology went wrong. My second chapter gives you a good sense of the nature of the Harappan landscape, the politics of Harappan's language. Then the subsequent 5 chapters are a very, very microscopic, detailed ethnography of the culture of archaeology. I talk about the hierarchies of ASI. I talk about what happened. So first I talk about the hierarchies in the official framework, then the hierarchies in the camp. Now, what is something stunning, and which is what I had a very good access to, is the archaeological camp, where the archaeologists would stay and plan their day's work. So I actually stayed with them for days and days over the course of 2 years, whenever the excavation would happen. So archaeologists, so I give you a very good sense of the microcultural politics in the camp. And I argue that this camp is a colonial camp, and there's no ambiguity about it. It's not even a post-colonial camp. It's fundamentally a colonial camp. It works within that logic of hierarchy. Now I then get into the excavation trench. So there are 3 chapters. I think it's let me just tell you the exact chapter name. I'm just looking up the contents. Just give me a second. I think, yeah. So chapter 4, 5, 6, 7, 4, 5, yeah, 5, 6, 7, 8 are detailed ethnographic chapters about how first a knowledge is produced, as in how do you even decide that this is a site you have to excavate? How is trenches prepared? what is the politics of, and here Wheeler comes constantly again and again, because the methods is completely Wheelerian. Then I talk about how this, once the trench has been laid, how do you even decide what to excavate, how to excavate, how do you measure, how do you tabulate, then what is the nature of representation. So I go into extraordinary details in that. As I said, this is for for me, my project was I realized when I was doing this ethnographic work that perhaps after me, it might be difficult for people to get this kind of access to the inside world of Indian archaeology. So when I was about to write my dissertation, I had to decide that do I spend a lot of time theorizing, or should I spend time giving you empirical evidence? And which is empirical evidence within the framework of anthropologists, right? Anthropologists are always subjective, but again, within the context of an anthropologist's evidence, which is what I try to do in this book, is that my work is very, very microscopic. It might, for those who are not familiar with this world, it might even become very, very boring. But what I'm trying to do is to give you very, very minute detail of how archaeologists of Archaeological Survey of India excavate Harappan trenches in the world of this highly politicized ecology in which they exist. My book then finally ends with Ayodhya, again the site that I really wanted to do ethnography, but I was not allowed, where the mosque was demolished. And since I could not get access to I could not do the ethnography, but I got access to the report. Now, the Ayodhya report is a very interesting report. They excavated for about, I think, 150 days during monsoon months. Now, archaeological acumen in India says that you cannot excavate in monsoon because trenches fall, it rains, right? You just, I mean, you can't excavate when it rains, right? But because the code, obviously, the code does not have any archaeological sensibility, it forces the ASI to excavate in the summer and monsoon months. So the excavation is a disaster. And I talk about and this is not, I'm not saying it's a disaster. The archaeologists of the ASI are themselves saying it's a disaster. So here's the problem, right? The archaeological of ASI are saying it's a disaster, then they're producing the knowledge. And then the knowledge is then used by the court, right? So the level of evidential corruption begins right from the word go, right? Now, what happens, and this is, so in this chapter, which is chapter 8, chapter 9 of the book, I specifically focus on the most important epistemological artifact of any archaeological excavation, the archaeological report, right? The archaeological report is the most important text, or the most important, I mean, for which you spend years and years excavating because you want to come out with the report. Now, what I found out that the ASI has a very, very, very bad history of report writing. Nearly out of the 300 large sites they had excavated over the course of from 1947, nearly about 60 to 70 sites were never ever reported. They were only small 2-page reports, but never a proper report of the site. And unfortunately, out of the 50-60 site, nearly majority of the excavators are dead now. So you will never see the report. So here is something disastrous, right? You excavate monumental sites for years, and then you don't produce anything. Now, in the case of Ayodhya, opposite happened. They excavated for 150 days and they got the report out in 25 days, which is because they were under the pressure of the code. And the report is, I mean, I talk about the report is completely, yeah, it's a very bad report. You know, if you see it, well, the report is so bad. And this is again, I'm not saying the report is so bad that the ASI never published it. So even the ASI recognized that this is not a great report, right? Now, so So what I try to do in this book is go from the microscopic to the meta, and from the meta to the microscopic. I'm constantly doing this back and forth in the book. Yeah, I think I should stop and open for questions. What you have, yeah.
So I'll get everyone on gallery, and you can sort of make a sign if you want to speak. But I just want to come back to something that you said just before we began, and you said, and I think that you're looking beyond Indian archaeology, and you're saying something about archaeology in general, about the chance to see it as some sort of, I don't know, scientific discipline, and or something that's disconnected from its colonial roots, and you were quite pessimistic about that. Could you just say a couple words about that?
Okay, so this is, so you know, when I started doing archaeology as a student, I think there was a lot of hope, right? Which is like all young archaeologists have, is that you're going into the terrain of the ancient and you will discover certain things that have never been known, right? But as a graduate student, I realized that was too romantic an idea. But as I progressed, what happens once I started reading, and I must admit, when I started reading Harder and Michael and the whole of post-process, I found again a sense of hope. That okay, here are a bunch of archaeologists who are really thinking differently, and probably that's the right direction. And over the years, when I was at Stanford, they started, because of Ian and Michael moved in almost simultaneously from Cambridge and Edinburgh around 1998, 1999. And there was a lot of hope and romanticism at Stanford. They started the Stanford Archaeological department. No, it's called Center, right? And I was there when it started, and there was a lot of exciting things that was happening. But what I found is that in all this excitement of archaeological theory, it was still very, very, okay, I'm going to use a word which might be a little bit harsh, but I thought it was very imperialistic. I would use the word Western. It was imperialistic. Is that even within the framework of post-processual archaeologists, feminist archaeologists, leftist archaeologists, Marxist archaeologists, contextual archaeologists, all these kind of archaeologists that was emerging from post-processual, it was still deeply confined to the European world, to Anglo-European world. And for most of these archaeologists, even for somebody like Ian and Michael, it was very, very Eurocentric. Although I must admit, all of them, even somebody like Lynn Meskel, and they're very empathetic to what is happening outside the West. But it was still, I found still something that was coming from the other side. If you look at theory making in archaeology is very, very Euro-American, right? There are very, very theorists who are outside the European American world. I think, and so this is something that really affected me. And so my attempt in this book is to show I'm not doing theory in this book. I'm highly theoretically informed, but I'm deliberately not doing theory because, again, I'm just going to put a footnote that thinking theoretically is also a Western preoccupation. This is something we have to understand. It is that to think theoretically, in the sense that even if you are going to use Heidegger, you're going to use Merleau-Ponty, you're going to use Derrida. For somebody who's coming from a non-European, Anglo-European training, it is completely alien, right? So what I try to do in this book is deliberately, I try to keep theory aside, because I think somewhere thinking theoretically is also an imperialistic way of thinking. So basically, again, I'm being very harsh, but I would like to say that it is like you stay in your American world, but the theory is supposed to be global, right? Which is not the case. And you see that in archaeologically very clearly, is that most archaeologists are in Euro and American. We can go all the way back to Binford and others who are thinking very theoretically, but they are not recognizing that things in India or in Africa is just radically different. And here what happens is that the belief that archaeological method is universal is flawed. And which is what I try to show in this book, is that probably Wheeler's method were fine in the 1940s and 50s and 60s in England. But Wheeler's method in India in the same decade was radically oppressive. So how then we think of archaeological theory in a universal framework? And this is my basic thought. And what I try to do in this work, in this book, is very clearly I'm saying that, okay, let me just show you a world of archaeological practice using what you would call a universal archaeological method and see how flawed it gets, right? And what I try to do in this book is basically to give evidence. And this is what I'm trying to do. Evidence as an anthropologist, not as a scientist. I'm a cultural anthropologist, so evidence with all its baggages, the baggage that I come with, right? But this is my world, and I'm showing you what it is from my point of view, right?
Well, yeah, I can just say that my copy of your book is full of marginal notes, things that ring familiar, that ring true. But let's hear from other people who are online with us. Any comments, questions from anyone?
I have a question. You described the political issues and the national point of the local archaeology. I assume you have foreign archaeologists who used to dig in the past and still digging today, foreign university and so on. Do you see any difference between the way they act as archaeologists in India?
Well, you know, what has happened in India in the last 10 years, because of the right-wing government that is there, is that more and more archaeologists of the state and also of the universities are tending to a right-wing narrative of India. To answer your question in a short way, my answer would be no. I don't see any difference or anybody else coming in a different way. The larger archaeological world in India is becoming more and more messy, if I would use that word. And also what has happened, and this is something that I'm sure is happening in other parts of the world, is the rise of social media epistemology, right? So people on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, you have influencers who are, like in India, there are about hundreds of archaeological influencers who have their own crazy theories. They are not trained as archaeologists, and they have huge, massive following, and they are basically peddling lies. Now, so here the problem has become far more graver than it was before social media. Before social media, we had just a dozen or 2 dozen right-wing archaeologists or pseudo-archaeologists who were writing books. But now we have hundreds, probably even thousands of, they're basically influencers, right? They don't have any training in archaeology or history. They just are people who come up with some facts or some lies, and they just peddle it. So the situation in India, and they have millions of followers. on places like Twitter and Facebook and other places. On YouTube, so for example, if you go on YouTube and you do Indian archaeology, 90% of the stuff is going to be, pardon my French, bullshit. Because these are people who are not trained, they are just going and coming out with fantastical narratives. So what we see in India is a far more graver situation what it was when I was doing my ethnography. That as I was explaining, archaeology is a very powerful arsenal. Now, for instance, archaeology is being used very, very, very powerfully to terrorize Muslim population in India. So if 1992, a mosque was demolished because it was falsely believed to be under a temple. And today in India, there are more than 100 mosques which are being threatened by Hindu fundamentalist forces for the same reason, without any archaeological or any factual evidence but just based on certain hearsay or some kind of a historical fiction. For example, I'll just give you the famous example. For example, Taj Mahal, which I'm sure all of you know, right? So Taj Mahal is now being threatened by Hindu fundamentalist forces because they believe that it was built over a Shivalinga, which is a Hindu goddess with Hindu god called Shiva, and they believe that it was built over a temple. Now, what we are seeing, and there's no evidence for that. There's completely no evidence. It's completely hearsay, fictional. We don't have any evidence. And what we see now that there are a number of such archaeological monuments, some of them like Taj Mahal, which are UNESCO heritage sites, being threatened on the basis of such falsehood. But along with these large sites, there are a number of smaller sites, which are also they're being threatened much more ferociously because they aren't protected. And we also hear of news very often that many Muslim sites are being obliterated completely randomly by the Hindu fundamentalists. Other thing, something more dangerous is that, and this is, I don't have any, let's say, textual evidence to provide, but from my informants, I've heard that Archaeological Survey of India, one of the big things that Archaeological Survey of India does is that 98% of its budget goes in doing heritage and preservation work, right? And I have been hearing from my informant is that the government of India, in the ASI, in the last few years, are deliberately decreasing funds to Muslim sites, in the sense that they are allowing these sites to crumble and not doing preservation work. So what you see in India now is it's a far more far more complicated and a far more oppressive moment. As an anthropologist of archaeologists, I can say that we are moving in a direction which is not going to be conducive for archaeological heritage, especially Muslim archaeological heritage.
Thank you. Any more questions or comments? Raz.
Yes, if I may, about Mortimer Wheeler, about his acceptance in Israel. It's also an interesting case that in Israel in the 1950s, they still worked in the locus to stratum, the Mandat period, former method, and the British were working in Jordan in the Wheeler Canyon already. And then they started to criticize the Israelis canyon. So Aharoni came with a defense claiming that they are working in an Israelite method of archaeology, which is better than Canyon Wheeler. And he managed to persuade some. So even in the 1990s, there were still people who cited the reports of Aharoni as they are going in this method. And in Chatzor, in one of the reports, I think this was in the early 2000s or late 1990s, he admitted that from the documentation of the excavation of Hatzor, he doesn't have any proof to really stratigraphical method, as Aaroni claimed that this is a good method stratigraphically, but in Hatzor he couldn't find evidence that they really did good stratigraphy with sections. So he said that there is a sentence written that, okay, the written evidence does not support it, but all the people I talked to, they all say that, yes, we worked wonderfully in stratigraphical, and I believe them. So it's actually upside down, I think. So in case of, and there's a lot of connection also to Israel today, and that the direction is not, I mean, not very optimistic in nationality in archaeology. We are going backwards, not forward. And another story, but please keep it, it's not yet published. Mortimer Wheeler said about Israel that this was the land of archaeological sin. And I think Kent Flannery wrote funnily that Mortimer Wheeler never excavated in South America. Otherwise, you could say it about South America. But what I found, this is not yet published, is that Mortimer Wheeler was candidate to lead the archaeological department in Palestine in the 1930s. And it was very close. He barely made it. He was the leading candidate. But because they were starting to think if maybe there is a partition and maybe they are not going to help Palestine, they postponed it. And then another person, Hamilton, who functioned well, got support from the High Commissioner. So Hamilton got the job and Mortimer Wheeler didn't. So it's a kind of funny situation when you consider his saying about archaeological sin. If he got the position, he would not be able to say it. Maybe the archaeology would look more like in India. I don't know if he got the position in Palestine. It's interesting to manipulate, but of course it didn't happen. But thank you for the lecture.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Raz. Anyone else? Well, I think you've given us a lot of food for thought. Here's a question coming from Nama.
Yeah, okay. So
yeah, you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, this is a very, very important question. So we know that, and this is, I mean, I want to, rather than use the word theory, I think it's important to use the word philosophy, right? So we know that there's nearly about 500 years of lineage philosophy in Western world, right? When I mean by lineage philosophy is that when we talk about somebody like Descartes, so from 16th century onwards, you have one after another Descartes student. And so there's a lineage of philosophers which reaches people like Heidegger and Derrida and Foucault, and you know, so somebody like Foucault would very easily have a conversation with his predecessors because there's a very clear lineage. There's definitely a very big break from the Greco-Roman philosophical tradition to the post-Renaissance tradition. So I'm not going to go into Greco-Roman. I'm talking about the last 500 years. There's a very robust tradition of philosophical thinking, which has given birth to modernity, to enlightenment, and so on and so forth. But what has happened in the process is that there were other equally robust traditions. So you have the Indian philosophical tradition. You also have a very strong Islamic philosophical tradition. Obviously, you have the Chinese philosophical tradition, the Japanese philosophical tradition. There are, and then then you have something called the Buddhist philosophy tradition, which moves from India to China to Japan, right? So you not only have, you know, regional philosophy tradition, but you also have, even that's the same with Islam, that Islamic philosophy tradition is not located to one region. You have different regions. And so you have these other philosophical traditions which have equally robust lineages running into a few hundred years of continuous learning and practice. I must admit, I'm not very familiar with the Islamic tradition. I'm not trained in the Islamic tradition or in the Chinese tradition, but I have a little bit of training in the Indian philosophical tradition. And over the years, my understanding is that I think look into the Indian philosophical tradition, especially to understand India and South Asia. I think it produces, or it shows us a different view. Now, the other thing that I also want to caution is that we are living in modern times. Modernity is not just hegemonic; it is ontological, right? There's no way one can escape modernistic practices in any sense. The very fact that I'm talking to you through a device which is an object which has been produced through this through modernity. So I think I'm not saying that you have to completely discard Western philosophical and theoretical tradition. What I'm suggesting is that there are other theoretical tradition, if employed or deployed, will produce a different way of thinking. And there is, for instance, in the Indian system, a very, very robust epistemological thinking way of thinking. Now, is it appropriate to use it in archaeology? I don't know. I have not done it. For instance, I know people who have done it in film theory. You know, film theory is another, it's another big thing like archaeological theory. Everybody does film theory. And so in film theory, what you see is, in film theory, people have tried to use Chinese philosophical tradition, Indian philosophical tradition to think through how film makes meaning. So I think there are few possibilities, but I must admit it is not a very robust possibility. I think my way of thinking would be is that, unfortunately, in the case of archaeology, is that it is fundamentally a modernistic enterprise. You know, it is a 17th, 18th century Enlightenment scientific enterprise, and that's the birth, right? So the reason I would be cautious about thinking in another way is that I think there's a need to look outside Anglo-American framework, right? For example, but it is still a very westernized thing. You see, for example, in Indian history, I don't know, within like post-colonial theory is a way of thinking. Although I think it's a way of thinking. It is still very, very Marxist, very Western in its approach. But that is one way. And I think there is a lot of criticism about post-colonial theory. But when I think of archaeological theory, I think it is important at this stage to realize one thing, which is what I'm trying to do in this book, is that archaeological method is not universal. That if you are going to be an archaeological, if you're going to make an archaeological theory, it needs to be localized. I think those global assertions should be the global assertions should not be, we have to be very careful. I mean, I'm going to end my response with, the book that is now being read by everyone, right? David's book. Right. So I found that book very fascinating, but fundamentally it's an imperialist project. It's an imperialist project. It's only somebody sitting in London can think of such a project. So here is a good example. Here's a good example is that I think David Graeber was at Yale when I was a postdoc there, and he's an extraordinary scholar. I mean, I'm not undermining that. I've met David Venkroth also. He was at Brown about a year ago. I think these are great scholars, but you can be great scholars, but that doesn't mean you cannot come up with an imperialist project, right? I mean, fundamentally, let's look at the history of Marxist thought. Marxist thought is radical, but it still had an imperialistic tendency, right? So for me, I think the important thing is to, for especially archaeological theorists, to kind of, I think if they do local theory, let's say, rather than global theory, I think we would be more, it will allow for, I think, let's put it this way, that would be less hegemonic, that would be less hegemonic.
Do you think, I guess one of the fields in which we can sort of broaden our philosophical horizons is considering time and temporality, which is treated so differently in different philosophical traditions, and we are sort of completely enthralled by a linear and measurable, quantifiable concept of time. I'm just wondering, apropos your talk, do you think that that this sort of question of who came first is something, you know, which you see with the mosque and the temple, is that something that is brought in? Does that have to do with this linear concept of time, and then whoever is first is, you know, wins the race, so to speak?
Well, you know, in the case of the mosque and the temple issue, is that, you know, it's definitely a modernistic project, right? We know very clearly is that Hindu fundamentalism is not is a modernistic project. You know, the group that is the fountainhead of Hindu fundamentalism is a group called the Rashtriya Samsevak, RSS, and it started exactly a century ago in 1924. And the founders of this group were going and meeting Mussolini, and were also going to Germany. And so it's a very fascist, fundamentalist, modernistic Hindu project. So the people who are claiming that we came first is emerging from a modernistic temporality, and because before that, you do not, at least in the historical record in India, we do not see such fixation with the origin. There are other kind of issues, but not such fundamental issues with the origin. I think the question of origin is also a very Enlightenment fetish, I would say. We do not see, at least in Indian philosophy, we do not see a question of origin. I think in Indian philosophy, either in Buddhist or Hindu or Jain, or even the Sufi Islamic philosophy that is there in India over about a millennium, you see other issues. It is more of an internal issue. It's more about the issue of quest within and the pitfalls of that quest, rather than finding who came first. But the other question of, you know, on a broader issue of temporality, here I just want to kind of talk a little bit about my filmic work. I mean, my film work deals with temporality. My work is very temporal and not narrative driven. And I think to answer, to kind of respond to the earlier question, I use, it's in my filmic work that I explore more Indian philosophical thought. And that's where I think I'm more comfortable doing that way. I must admit, this might sound a bit weird, but I think of myself as a lapsed archaeologist in that sense. I must say I'm a little cynical about the archaeological project. And having spent nearly 25 years thinking very carefully of it, I must admit, again, I'm sorry, all of you, I think it's beyond redemption. I'm sorry about this.
Okay, Ashish, I think that's a great point for us to end, and to thank you for joining us and for this fascinating talk. And there's a lot to think about, and we'll certainly be in touch as we progress down the slippery slope to join the Indian Archaeological Survey. Okay.
Thank you, Rafi. Thank you, all of you who have come and spent time to listen to me. I hope this is useful. You have, I think Rafi has circulated the PDF. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I'll be happy to talk to you over the email. And thanks a lot, Rafi, for inviting me. The only request is that the fact that you've recorded this session, I'll be really grateful if you can email me the audio recording or the video recording whenever it's convenient for you. Just for my archive. I will love that.
Very good. Very good.
Thank you.